She never planned to walk into the Vampire King's palace. She never planned to offer her throat to a monster. But when Mara Voss stood at the iron gates of Castle Noctherin at midnight, her younger sister dying in a village healer's arms 3 miles away, planning had nothing to do with it. The gates were taller than any structure in the lower city. Black iron twisted into shapes that looked almost like screaming faces if the moonlight hit them wrong. Mara had heard stories about this place her entire life. Every child in Valdenmoor grew up knowing 2 things. Don't go near the Ashwater River after dark, and never, under any circumstance, knock on the Vampire King's door. Mara knocked. 3 times. Hard. The sound rang out across the empty courtyard like a death knell. Nothing happened for a long moment. Wind moved through the dead oak trees lining the approach road, branches scraping against each other in the dark. Mara pulled her cloak tighter and knocked again, louder, because her sister's name was Elia, and she was 17 years old, and she had a fever that had turned black at the edges, the kind of fever that village healers whispered about and then looked away from, the kind that only one thing in the known world could cure. Vampire venom, not a bite to kill or to turn, a single controlled drop, administered with precision, placed directly on the infected wound site. The old texts called it the cold mercy. It burned the corruption out of the blood, the way frost killed rot on fruit. Painful, dangerous, but possible. The gates opened. No one touched them. They simply swung inward on silent hinges, and the darkness beyond them was a different quality of dark. Deeper, older, like the absence of light was itself a living thing. Mara walked through anyway, because Elia's face had been gray that morning, and her breathing had started making a sound like wet paper tearing, and there was simply nothing left to be afraid of that was worse than that. A figure appeared at the end of the courtyard. Tall, still, dressed in black so complete he was barely distinguishable from the shadows behind him. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and his head slightly tilted, the posture of someone who had been watching her approach for longer than she'd been walking. Cale Dravenmore, Vampire King of the Northern Reaches, 800 years old if the stories were accurate. Ruler of 3 provinces, commander of a bloodline army, the man whose name mothers used to quiet screaming children. Mara stopped 6 feet away and looked directly at him, because she had decided on the walk over that she would not look at the ground. Looking at the ground was something you did when you had already accepted defeat, and she had not accepted anything yet. His face was unexpected. She had imagined something monstrous, something that matched the gates and the dead trees and the quality of the darkness. Instead, his face was angular and precise, the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled with specific intent, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a line so neutral it gave away nothing. His eyes were dark, not red, not glowing, simply dark, the way deep water was dark, not because there was nothing there, but because whatever was there did not feel the need to announce itself. "You knocked," Cale said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. Not warm either, simply factual, the way a man speaks when he has stopped being surprised by anything the world sends to his door. "My sister is dying." Mara kept her voice steady through an act of will she would think about later with some pride. "Ah, she has the black rot fever. It started in a wound on her left arm 4 days ago, and it has moved to her chest. The village healer says she has until morning." Cale said nothing. He watched Mara with the particular stillness of something that did not need to fill silence the way humans did. "I know what cures it," Mara continued. "I know you can do it. 1 drop of venom on the wound site. I've read the texts. I know it works." "The texts are 300 years old," Cale said. "They describe a process that hasn't changed." Mara had read every version she could find in the lower city archive. She had spent 2 days reading while Elia burned and the healer shook his head. The corruption responds to the cold compound in pure vampire venom. The chemistry doesn't change because centuries passed. Something shifted in Cale's expression, not warmth, more like the slight adjustment of someone recalibrating their expectations of a conversation. "You've done your research. I didn't come here to make an emotional appeal." Mara's hands were shaking inside her cloak, but her voice held. "I came here to make a practical one, You have something my sister needs. I have nothing of equivalent value to offer you, except one thing." The wind moved through the dead oaks again. Mara reached up and pulled the collar of her cloak to the side, exposing the line of her throat to the cold night air, and to whatever calculation was happening behind those dark eyes. "Take what you need," she said, in exchange for saving her. The silence that followed was the longest of Mara's life. Cale moved, not fast, not the terrifying vampire speed she had braced for. He crossed the remaining distance between them at a pace that was almost deliberate, almost careful, and stopped close enough that she could feel the cold that came off him, the way cold came off stone in winter, radiating outward, ancient and absolute. His eyes dropped to her throat, and something moved through them that she couldn't name. "You understand what you're offering," he said quietly. "Yes. You understand it will hurt." Mara thought about Elia's gray face. "Yes." Cale's hand came up, and this was the part she hadn't prepared for, gently. His fingers curved around her jaw with a precision that felt almost clinical, tilting her head to the side, and Mara focused on a point somewhere above the castle roofline and breathed through her nose and did not move. His fangs pierced her throat. The pain was immediate and total, a burning cold that shot down her spine and spread outward through her shoulders, her chest, her fingertips. She made a sound she hadn't planned to make, and her hands flew up and gripped the front of his coat because her legs had simply decided to stop working, and he was the nearest solid thing. Then it was over. Cale stepped back. His expression had changed. The careful neutrality fractured into something complicated and fast-moving, there and gone before she could read it properly. His hand came up and pressed a cloth to her throat with a gentleness that felt jarringly out of place. Mara's legs found themselves again. "Her sister," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Cale was already turning toward the gates. A carriage was waiting at the side gate. Mara didn't ask how. She simply climbed in when the door was opened for her by a silent attendant whose eyes stayed carefully directed at the ground, and pressed the cloth to her own throat, because Cale had dropped it in her hand without explanation, and apparently expected her to manage herself, which she appreciated more than the alternative. Cale sat across from her in the dark interior of the carriage. He hadn't invited himself. He had simply gotten in, settled against the opposite seat with that quality of absolute stillness he seemed to carry everywhere, and looked out the window as the carriage moved. As if accompanying her to her dying sister's bedside in the middle of the night was something he did regularly, as if nothing about this evening required comment. Mara watched him from the corner of her eye and tried to organize what had just happened into something her mind could file away properly. She had gone to the Vampire King's castle. She had offered her throat. He had taken what she offered. The exchange was complete. Now they were going to save Elia. This was a transaction, and she understood transactions. What she did not understand was why he had come. She hadn't asked him to. The venom could have been collected and sent with a servant. There was no practical reason for the Vampire King of the Northern Reaches to personally accompany a lower city woman to a healer's cottage at midnight. Mara opened her mouth to ask. Cale spoke first, without looking away from the window. "How long has she had the fever?" 4 days. Mara adjusted the cloth at her throat. It started as a regular wound infection, a cut she got helping a neighbor repair a roof. Then 3 days ago it turned. He nodded once, the slight movement of someone filing information. "The cold mercy works best before the corruption reaches the lungs," he said. "If it has already settled there." "It hasn't." Mara kept her voice firm, because she needed it to be true. The healer said the chest involvement is secondary. The primary site is still the arm wound. Cale finally looked at her. The carriage lantern threw dim moving light across his face, and in it he looked less like a king and more like something older than that, something that had been watching human lives begin and end for so long that the watching itself had become a kind of grief. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," Mara said. And then, because she was honest by nature, and this felt like a situation that required honesty, "I'm mostly certain." Something moved at the corner of Cale's mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the memory of one. The healer's cottage was a 20-minute ride from the castle gates. Mara spent most of it watching Kale not look at her and trying to decide how she felt about the throbbing at her throat. It hurt less than she expected. Or perhaps she was simply in that state beyond pain, where the body had made its peace and was moving forward on pure determination. When the carriage stopped, she was out the door before the attendant could open it. The cottage was lit from within, warm amber light through the single front window. Mara pushed inside without knocking. Healer Orvis looked up from where he sat beside the low bed, with an expression that moved rapidly from startlement to confusion to something approaching terror, as Kale came through the door behind her. Orvis stood so fast his chair scraped back across the stone floor. He started. Sit down. Kale's voice was not unkind and not loud, but it had the quality of a thing that was not accustomed to being argued with. Orvis sat. Mara was already at Elia's side. Her sister looked smaller than she had that morning. 17 years old, and she looked 12, collapsed against the pillows with her dark hair plastered to her forehead, and her breath coming in those terrible shallow pulls that made Mara's chest tighten with something close to fury. Fury at the wound, at the fever, at the specific cruelty of illness that chose the young and the gentle. Mara took her hand. Elia's fingers were hot and dry and did not curl around hers. Kale came to stand on the other side of the bed. He looked at the wound on Elia's arm, the bandaging that Orvis had changed twice that day, already showing the dark staining at the edges that meant the corruption was active and moving. "Remove the bandage," he said to Orvis. Orvis removed it with hands that trembled only slightly. The wound beneath was ugly, black at the perimeter, the skin around it gone tight and wrong-colored. Mara had seen it that morning, but it was worse now, and she kept her face still because Elia did not need to wake to her sister's fear. Kale studied the wound for a moment. Then he did something Mara hadn't expected. Kale sat down. Not stood over the bed in a posture of authority. Sat, in the healer's chair, bringing himself level with the patient the way a physician would. He extended one hand to Orvis without looking at him. A clean cloth, folded. Orvis produced one. Kale's other hand came up, and Mara watched with a focus so complete she forgot to breathe as he opened a small cut on his own palm with a precision that suggested long practice, collected what was needed with clinical efficiency, and then leaned forward and administered the cold mercy to her sister's wound with a steadiness and care that looked nothing like what Mara had imagined this moment would look like. Elia's body responded immediately, a sharp intake of breath, her back arching slightly, Mara's hand tightening around her fingers, and then a long exhale. The fever tension in her face loosened, not gone, not yet, but loosened, the way a fist loosens when the thing causing pain is removed. Kale sat back. His expression gave away nothing, but he watched Elia's face with an attention that felt personal rather than clinical, as if the outcome of this mattered to him in some way Mara could not account for. The blackening at the wound edges was already fading. Mara stared at it. "It works fast," she said. "Faster in the young," Kale said quietly. "Her body will fight the rest of it. By morning the fever should break." Mara looked at her sister's face. The gray was already less complete, color moving back in like dawn. She let out a breath she had been holding since that morning, and it came out longer and shakier than she intended, and she pressed her free hand to her mouth for a moment and looked at the wall and got herself back together because she was not going to fall apart in front of the vampire king. When she looked back, Kale was watching her, not with the calculating attention of earlier, with something quieter than that, something that had no clear name. "Thank you," Mara said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. Kale said nothing. He looked back at Elia. Outside the cottage window, the night had moved past its deepest point and was beginning, imperceptibly, to think about morning. He did not leave. Mara noticed that. He made no move to stand, no gesture toward departure. He simply remained in the healer's chair beside her dying, beside her sister's bed, in a cottage that was too small for his presence and too ordinary for everything he represented, and he stayed. Orvis had retreated to a corner and appeared to be attempting to become part of the wall. Mara pulled a second chair close to the bed and sat down and kept her hand around Elia's, and did not ask Cale why he was still there, because she was afraid of how much the answer might matter. Elia's fever broke at 4 in the morning. Mara knew the exact moment because she had been awake for all the hours between, watching the rise and fall of her sister's chest with the particular vigilance of someone who has decided that if they simply do not look away, nothing bad will be permitted to happen. When the change came, it was subtle, a shift in the quality of Elia's breathing, a deepening that meant rest rather than endurance, the flush on her cheeks moving from the wrong kind of heat to something more natural. Mara pressed her forehead to the back of Elia's hand for a moment and closed her eyes. When she straightened, Cale was watching her. He had not moved from the chair. 800 years old, and he had sat in a village healer's wooden chair for 4 hours without apparent discomfort or impatience, without speaking except when Orvis needed instruction, without doing anything except being present in a way that Mara had eventually stopped trying to interpret and simply accepted the way you accepted weather. "She's stable," Orvis said from his corner, emerging now that the crisis had clearly passed. "The wound corruption is gone. Remarkable." He said the word the way people said it when they meant impossible, but were too practical to argue with results. Cale stood. The movement was fluid and immediate, none of the stiffness of a human body that had been still for hours. He straightened his coat, looked at Elia once more, then looked at Mara. "The carriage will take you home when you're ready," he said. Mara stood as well. "I'll stay until she wakes." Cale nodded once. He moved toward the door and Mara watched him and felt the specific discomfort of someone who has a thing to say and is trying to decide if the moment is right for saying it. The moment was never going to feel right, so she said it anyway. "You didn't have to stay," she said. Cale stopped with his hand on the doorframe. His back was to her and she couldn't see his face. "No," he said. Then he left. Mara listened to the carriage move away on the road outside, and then sat back down next to Elia, and tried to decide what to do with the fact that the Vampire King had just spent 4 hours in a healer's cottage, for no reason she could identify. Elia woke at 7 in the morning with the clean confusion of someone returning from a long distance. Her eyes opened and found Mara's face, and she said, in a voice rough with sleep and recovery, "Why do you look like you haven't slept?" "Because I haven't." Mara smoothed the hair back from her sister's forehead. "How do you feel?" Elia considered this with the honest assessment of someone whose body had just fought a significant battle. "Terrible," she said, "but less terrible than yesterday." "That's sufficient," Mara said. Elia's eyes dropped to Mara's throat, to the cloth still pressed there, the edges of it dark now with dried blood. Her expression shifted. "Mara, it's fine. What did you do?" Mara looked at her sister's face, the color returning, the eyes clear, the particular quality of aliveness that had been draining away for 4 days, now firmly restored, and said, "What needed to be done?" Elia stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached up and took Mara's hand and held it the way she had when she was small, tight and certain. They stayed like that while the morning came in through the single window, and Orvis made tea and the ordinary world reassembled itself around them. Mara went home in the afternoon, after Orvis confirmed Elia could be moved, and after they had settled her into her own bed with enough food and warmth and instruction for the next 3 days. The walk back to the room Mara rented in the lower city took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it not thinking about Cale Dravenmore, which required enough active effort that she was aware she was doing it. The room was cold. She hadn't lit the stove before leaving the previous night, because she hadn't known if she'd be coming back, and there was no point in a warm room if you weren't in it. She lit it now, and changed out of her clothes and looked at her throat in the small mirror above the wash basin. 2 marks, small, already beginning to close, which she knew was a property of the bite itself. Vampire bites sealed faster than ordinary wounds, another thing she had learned from the old texts. The surrounding skin was bruised slightly, deep purple-blue against the pale. It didn't look the way she had imagined it would look. It looked almost delicate somehow, which felt like the wrong word for something a monster had done, but she was too tired to locate a better one. She slept for 5 hours. When she woke, there was a knock at her door. Mara pulled on her coat over her shirt because the stove hadn't fully caught yet, and opened the door to find one of Cale's silent attendants standing in the hallway. She recognized him from the cottage, same careful downward gaze, holding a small box made of dark wood. "From His Majesty," the attendant said, and then, before she could respond, he was gone down the stairs. Mara brought the box inside and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. She opened it. Inside, nestled in dark cloth, were three things. A small sealed vial of what the accompanying card, plain, written in a precise hand, identified as a pain compound for the bite site, to be applied twice daily. A second vial identified as a general restorative, for fatigue. And beneath both of these, a book, old, leather-bound. The title pressed into the cover in faded gold. The Cold Mercy, a complete medical history of vampire venom and human treatment. It was the text she had been working from, the original, not the copy she had found in the lower city archive, the one that had reportedly been held in private collection for 2 centuries. Mara sat down in the chair by the stove and held the book and felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately categorize. Then she opened the front cover. Inside, in the same precise handwriting as the card, was a single line. You read the texts. You understood them. Most people don't bother. No signature, no title, just the words, direct and plain, and beneath them, something that might have been the beginning of something else, crossed out once, firmly, and left unwritten. Mara closed the book carefully. Outside the window, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and the lower city was making its ordinary sounds. Carts on cobblestones, voices calling across the market square, the particular rhythm of a place that did not know or care that anything unusual had happened the night before. Mara looked at the crossed-out words beneath the ones she could read. She thought about a man sitting in a wooden chair for 4 hours for no reason he had offered to explain. She put the book on the shelf above the stove where she kept the things she wanted to be able to reach easily. Then she got up and lit the lamp and started thinking about what she was going to do next. She went back. Not immediately, not without thinking about it, which she did for 3 days with the thoroughness she applied to most things, systematically, without flinching from the uncomfortable conclusions. She went over the exchange from every angle. The transaction was complete. Elia was recovering. The debt, if there was one, ran in Mara's direction, and she had already paid it. There was no practical reason to return to Castle Nocturne. She went on the 4th day. The gates opened before she knocked this time. The same attendant from the cottage met her in the courtyard and led her inside without question or explanation, which meant either the Vampire King had given standing instructions, or he had known she was coming before she arrived, both of which she decided not to think about too carefully. The interior of the castle was not what she expected. She had braced for the Gothic excess of story, dripping candelabras, blood-stained tapestries, bones in corners. What she found instead was something closer to a library that had grown large enough to contain a building. Books everywhere. Maps. Stacked manuscripts on every surface. The bones of a working mind that had been accumulating material for 8 centuries. She was shown into a room that was clearly a study, left there, and the attendant closed the door. Mara looked at the shelves. Floor to ceiling, 3 walls, a ladder on a rail for the upper sections. She moved to the nearest shelf and began reading spines the way she always did in any room containing books, automatically, helplessly, because the habit was older than any decision she'd made about her own behavior. She was on the 2nd shelf when Cale came in. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. His eyes moved to her hands. She had a book half pulled from the shelf, caught in the act, and something shifted in his expression that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to amusement. "The restorative worked," she said, pushing the book back. She turned to face him. "And the pain compound. Thank you." Cale moved into the room. He was dressed differently than the night at the gates, less formal, no coat, shirt and dark trousers, the clothing of someone who had not been expecting a visitor. He looked, for a moment, more like the age he appeared than the age he was. "You came to return thanks in person," he said. "I came to return the book." Mara held it out. "The original text should be in a proper archive, not... Keep it." She looked at him. He was looking at the book with an expression she couldn't read. I've had it for 200 years, he said. I've read it. It serves no purpose sitting in a collection. Mara lowered the book. It's worth significantly more than what I offered you. That's not how I'm measuring the exchange. How are you measuring it? The question came out more direct than she'd intended and landed in the room with a weight that made the air feel slightly different. Cale looked at her steadily. Not the calculating assessment of the first night. Something more considered. Sit down, he said. Mara sat. Not because she was accustomed to following instructions, but because she was genuinely curious what came after the offer of a seat, which was not nothing. Cale sat across from her, not behind the desk, in the chair across from hers, which she noted, and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet, as if silence was a medium he was comfortable moving through. You came to my gate without an appointment, without a guard, without anything except an argument, he said. In the middle of the night. I didn't have time for an appointment. Most people who come to me without time for an appointment come with weapons. I came with a collar pulled to the side, Mara said. Something in his face shifted again. There and gone. Yes, he said. You did. He looked at her throat. The bruising had faded to yellow at the edges now, nearly gone. You're healing well. I heal quickly. She paused. Always have. The healer in the village used to say it was unusual. Cale's eyes sharpened slightly. The shift was small, but she was developing an eye for small shifts. What kind of unusual? Cuts that closed before they should. Fevers that broke too fast. She watched his face. Is that relevant? It might be. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention now, and it was a significant thing to be looked at that way. Like she was a text he was trying to translate, and was finding more complex than anticipated. There are some bloodlines in the lower territories that carry a minor adaptive trait. Not enough to change what a person is, but enough to affect how they respond to certain things. To vampire venom. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The particular quality of his stillness was confirmation enough. Mara absorbed this. Then, because she was the kind of person who found facts steadying rather than frightening, she said, Is that why the bite closed faster than it should have? Likely. And why it hurt less than I expected. Cale's jaw moved slightly. It should have been considerably more painful, he said. His voice had gone quieter. What you described, the immediate burn, then fading, that's not typical. What's typical? He looked away briefly. When he looked back, his expression was more careful. Most people lose consciousness. Mara thought about standing in the courtyard holding the front of his coat because her legs had stopped working, and then straightening herself back out again within 30 seconds. She thought about the old texts she had read, the clinical descriptions she had studied for 2 days in the archive. She thought about the 4 hours he had sat in a healer's wooden chair. You were surprised, she said. Cale met her eyes. Yes, he said, quietly and without qualification. I was. The lamp on the desk threw warm light across the room, and outside the castle windows the afternoon was clear and cold, and the kind of ordinary that felt strange, pressed up against the edges of this conversation. Mara looked at the book in her hands, at the precise handwriting on the inside cover, at the crossed-out words she had been thinking about for 4 days. What did you cross out? She asked. The silence that followed was longer than his other silences, different in texture. Something that wasn't relevant, Cale said. Mara looked up at him. He was looking at the window. She decided not to push on it, not today. She had learned that some things revealed themselves better when you left them room to do it on their own timeline, and she had the sense that whatever was happening in this room operated on a timeline considerably longer than anything she was used to. She stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the texts. He had read things she hadn't found, new sources she didn't know existed, had opinions about the scholarship that were precise and occasionally withering in a way that made her argue back, which he seemed to find, again, close to amusing. When she left, the attendant showed her out and the carriage was waiting, and she hadn't asked for it. She kept the book. She came back the following week, and the week after that. There was no formal arrangement, no invitation issued, no time specified. Mara would arrive at the castle gates in the early evening and they would open, and she would be shown to the study, and Cale would come in. Sometimes immediately, sometimes after a wait she spent usefully examining his shelves, and they would talk. About books, about the history of the northern reaches and the parts of it that the official records left out, about the old medical texts and the things the scholars who wrote them had gotten wrong, about Aaliyah, whose recovery was complete and who had gone back to her work at the market and who asked Mara every few days where she kept going in the evenings with a directness that Mara deflected, with a consistency that was becoming less convincing. What they did not talk about was the night at the gates, the exchange, what it had cost and what it had been worth, the crossed-out words in the front of the book. These things existed in the room with them, the way large pieces of furniture existed, present, unavoidable, simply not directly addressed. On the 5th visit, Cale was not in the study when she arrived. She waited for 20 minutes and then, because she was constitutionally unsuited to simply sitting in a room, she got up and went to the shelves and found a text she hadn't seen before. Cartography, old, the maps inside drawn in a style that suggested the cartographer had strong opinions about what was important enough to name. She was standing at the window with it when the door opened. Cale came in. He was dressed in a coat she hadn't seen before, dusty at the shoulders, carrying a rolled document under one arm. He had clearly been somewhere that involved moving through actual space, rather than sitting in a study, which was easy to forget was a thing he did. He stopped when he saw her, not with surprise, with something else, something he managed quickly. There was a situation in the eastern boundary, he said, moving to the desk and setting the document down. It required my attention. Is it resolved? For now. He looked at her by the window with the old cartography book in her hands, and something moved through his expression that she was learning to track. The small shifts, the things that happened at the edges of his careful neutrality. The eastern boundary situation, Mara would learn later, had involved a dispute between two lesser vampire houses that had been approaching violence for 3 months. Cale had resolved it in 4 hours by showing up in person and being, by all accounts, extremely quiet, in a way that communicated extensive information. She put the book down on the window ledge and turned to face him. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. Cale settled himself against the edge of the desk in a posture that was almost casual. He waited. "The night Elia's fever broke," she said. "The morning. You were still there." "Yes." She'd been thinking about how to phrase this for several visits. She had not found a version that felt both honest and comfortable, so she had decided to simply use honest. "You didn't have to be," she said. "The venom was administered. The transaction was complete. You could have left." Cale looked at her steadily. The lamp behind him threw his face partly into shadow and partly into warm light, and in this configuration, he looked very old and very tired, in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I wanted to know," he said, "whether it had worked." She absorbed this, whether Elia was going to be all right. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone choosing words from a large available vocabulary and selecting the most accurate ones, he said, "Whether you were going to be all right." The room did the thing where it felt slightly different. Mara looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that was not the careful neutrality she was used to. Something had been removed from it, some layer of management, and what was underneath was more complicated and considerably less comfortable to have directed at her. "The bite," she said. He moved away from the desk, not toward her, toward the window she'd just left, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the dark. "Not just the bite," he said. "You came to my gate in the middle of the night alone. You offered yourself to something most people run from. You didn't shake. You didn't beg." He paused. "And when it was over, you stood up and asked about your sister." "A lot of people would have done the same," Mara said. Cale turned from the window to look at her. "No," he said simply. "They wouldn't." Mara crossed her arms. Not defensively. She did it when she was thinking. "The crossed-out words," she said. Cale went very still. "What did they say?" The silence stretched. She had pushed on it this time, deliberately. because she had decided the timeline for leaving things alone was complete. Cale turned back to the window. His hands, clasped behind his back, shifted slightly. "I wrote," he said, "that I had not expected to find someone interesting." Mara looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, and then I crossed it out, because it wasn't relevant. His hands stilled, after a moment, without turning, because I was not certain it was only interesting. The lamp on the desk flickered once in a draft from somewhere. Outside the castle windows, the night was fully established now, the kind of dark that this part of the world did completely. No gradation, just the transition from not dark to dark in the space of an hour. Mara uncrossed her arms. She picked up the cartography book from the window ledge and brought it to the desk and set it down and said, in a voice that was even and deliberate, "You could have left it crossed out." Cale turned from the window. Something in his expression was undefended in a way she hadn't seen before, and it looked almost unfamiliar on his face, like a feature that didn't get much use. "You asked?" he said. Mara sat down in her chair. Cale remained standing for a moment, then sat in his. The room settled back around them. She stayed for 3 more hours. They argued about the cartographer's choices, and then about the political situation in the eastern boundary, and then about a historical event in the northern reaches, 300 years ago, that Cale had been present for, and the official record of which, he informed her with a flatness that suggested genuine irritation, was wrong in 4 significant ways. When she left, he walked her to the gate. He hadn't done that before. She didn't comment on it. She walked through the gate and turned and looked at him standing on his side of the iron, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one with the layer of management removed, and she thought about interesting, and not certain it was only that, and she said good night and walked to the carriage. Behind her, she heard the gate close, slowly, as if not in any particular hurry. Elia found out on a Tuesday. Not because Mara told her, and not because she asked again in the deflectable way she had been asking. She found out because she came to Mara's room to return a borrowed pot, and Mara was in the middle of getting dressed to go out for the evening, and Elia looked at her, and looked at the time, and looked at the coat laid out on the bed, the good one, the dark wool one that Mara did not wear to the market or the archive, and put the pot down on the table, with a deliberateness that meant a conversation was happening, whether Mara wanted one or not. "Where do you go?" Elia said. Not a question. An arrival. Mara finished fastening her cuffs. Out. Out where? Elia sat down in the chair by the stove with the posture of someone who had made a decision about the duration of this conversation. "You've been going somewhere every week for 2 months. You come back with books I've never seen, and you have an expression you didn't have before." "What expression?" "Like you're thinking about something you haven't decided yet." Mara picked up her coat. She looked at her sister. Elia was fully recovered, completely herself again. The market vendor competence back in her face, and the specific quality of attention she gave to things she cared about entirely restored. "You remember the night the fever broke," Mara said. Elia's expression shifted. "Of course. How it was cured." A pause. "Yes." Mara put on her coat. "I go to the castle." The silence in the room was brief and total. Elia stared at her. "For how long?" 2 months. "And you've been—" "Talking," Mara said. "Mostly. We talk." Elia looked at her for a long time with an expression cycling through several things. Mara could track most of them. The initial shock, the rapid reassessment, the part where she thought about the night of the fever, and what Mara's throat had looked like with the cloth pressed to it, the part where she started to say something and stopped. "What is he like?" Elia said finally. Mara considered this with the honesty the question deserved. "Precise," she said. "Difficult. He reads everything and has opinions about all of it. He's been alive for 800 years, and it has made him not cold exactly. More like," she paused, "more like someone who learned to be careful with things a long time ago and hasn't found a reason to stop." Elia was quiet for a moment. "Does he? He's not. This isn't—" "I wasn't going to say anything alarming," Elia said mildly. Mara put her hands in her coat pockets. "It's not something I know how to name yet." Elia looked at her. You've never not known how to name something. I know. That's how Mara knew it herself, fully and without remaining uncertainty, in the moment of saying it. The knowing arrived in the form of that admission. I don't know how to name this, which was the most honest thing she had said about it to anyone, including herself. She went to the castle. Cale was in the study but not sitting. He was standing at the large table in the center of the room, which was covered in maps, leaning over one of them with his hands flat on the surface. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it had been doing for the past several visits, settled, as if her presence was a thing that had a settling effect. The eastern boundary situation had returned, he told her, and this time it had brought additional complications in the form of 2 council members whose interest in the boundary dispute was primarily financial rather than political. He described the situation in the precise, unvarnished way he described everything, and Mara pulled up a chair to the table and looked at the maps and asked questions, and they worked through it together in the way they had been working through things, her seeing the human political angles he sometimes underestimated, him understanding the vampire political dynamics she was still learning. At some point the hour became late, and neither of them addressed it. At some further point, Mara realized she was tired, the specific tired of someone who had been at the archive all morning before coming here, and had put her head back against the high chair and closed her eyes for what she intended to be a moment of rest, and had instead drifted. She woke to quiet. The lamp on the desk had been turned down low. The maps had been carefully moved to one side of the table, not disturbed but repositioned, and over her shoulders there was a coat that was not hers, heavier than hers, dark wool that smelled like cedar, and something older, the specific cold of a person who ran cold by nature, now held in the fabric. Mara was still for a moment. Cale was sitting across the table from her, not in proximity, giving distance, with a book open in front of him that she suspected had been serving its purpose for some time, because the page he was on had not changed. He was watching her, and when her eyes opened, he looked down at the book with a particular pointedness that would have been convincing if she hadn't been awake long enough to note the page. "I fell asleep," she said. "Or about an hour," he said, without looking up. She looked down at the coat around her shoulders. She did not remove it. "You should have. You were tired. You didn't need to." Cale looked up. His expression was undefended again, that feature with insufficient use. "You were tired," he said again, simply, as if this was its own complete argument, which she supposed it was. Mara looked at him across the table. She thought about Elia saying you have an expression you didn't have before. She thought about not knowing how to name it. She thought about the crossed-out words and the 4 hours in the wooden chair, and the coat around her shoulders, and the page of the book that had not changed. "Cale," she said. He looked at her. "I know what I would call it," she said, "if you asked me." The room went very still. He didn't ask. He sat across the table with the undefended expression and waited, which was what he did. He moved through silence like it was native territory and let things come to him at their own pace. But he was waiting. Mara pulled the coat a little tighter around her shoulders and said, "I think I'd call it something I didn't plan for." Cale was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone who has selected the most accurate words from a large available vocabulary, that would be the correct name. Mara looked at him. He looked back. Outside the castle, the night moved through its hours, and inside the study the lamp burned low, and nothing was resolved in the way that made it less complicated or easier to navigate. But something was named, and naming things was always, for Mara, where the actual work began. The apology happened on a night she hadn't expected it. 6 weeks into what she had privately begun calling, with some internal irony, a situation. She had arrived at the usual time to find Cale in a state she hadn't seen before. Not agitated, because she was not sure agitated was within his range, but something with similar energy underneath it. Controlled and tight the way certain materials were tight, the kind of tight that meant the controlling was active rather than passive. He was at the window when she came in, not looking at anything, just standing. She set her bag down and looked at him. "Bad day," she said. Cale turned. Something in his face was working. She watched it. In the months she had been coming here, she had developed a considerable facility for reading the small shifts in his expression, the ones that most people missed because they were looking for larger signals, and these were the precision instruments of a man who had learned to manage himself across 8 centuries. "What happened?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the desk and sat, not in the chair across from hers, but in his own, behind the desk, which he rarely used because it put furniture between them, and she had noticed that he had stopped wanting furniture between them. "I was contacted today by a family," he said. His voice was even, controlled. She waited. "A woman died the night of the new moon, 11 years ago," he said. "From my bite. She was not the first. She was not the last, that year. But her family has been attempting to locate recourse, legal grounds. There are none technically. My bite has always been documented as an involuntary phenomenon. The curse established that precedent 300 years ago." He paused. "But her daughter is 17 now." The daughter wrote the letter. Mara looked at him. "She said her mother used to tell her stories," Cale continued, "before she died, about the vampire king who was lonely. She said her mother wasn't afraid of him even though she should have been. She said she thought maybe he hadn't meant it. The study was very quiet." "She's right," Mara said carefully, "that you hadn't meant it." "Yes." Cale looked at his hands on the desk. They were still. "That's not the same as it not having happened." Mara said nothing. She had learned that he didn't need her to fix things when he said them. He needed to say them and have someone present when he did. 43 women, he said, in 300 years. Some were strangers. Some I had spoken with. Some I had, he stopped. Some I had believed, for a short time, might be different. He looked up. I told myself the curse was the reason. The curse was responsible. I told myself long enough that I stopped counting. He looked back at his hands. I started counting again 300 years ago, and I have not stopped. Mara stood up. She crossed to the desk, not around it, directly to his side of it, and sat on the edge of it near his chair, and looked at him at close range. Cale looked up at her. Something in his face was open in a way she had only seen in isolated moments, the undefended version, but more so now, pulled further open by the weight of what he had just said. 43, Mara said. Yes, you remember all of them. Every one, he said. Their names, the circumstances, he stopped. The exact amount of time between the bite and the end. He said it with the flatness of someone who has lived with a fact so long it has become simply geography, simply the shape of the ground they walk on, not more or less terrible for being familiar. Mara looked at him. She thought about the night at the gates, the cold precision of it, the 4 hours in the chair afterward, the box with the book and the crossed-out words. She thought about a man who had been counting for 300 years. You came to the cottage, she said. Cale met her eyes. You sat there for 4 hours, she said. You could have sent the venom with a servant. You could have sent it by any number of means. You came yourself and you stayed through the night. He was still looking at her. I think, Mara said quietly, that you have been trying to apologize for a very long time, to a very long list, through actions rather than words, because there are no words adequate to the list, and you know that. The silence in the study had a texture to it, heavy and old. I came that night, Cale said, because I did not trust anyone else to do it correctly. He paused, and because when you stood at my gate without shaking, He stopped. You what? Mara said. Something moved through his face, complex and layered and quick. I didn't want to be the thing that destroyed you, he said, the way I have been the thing that destroyed others. I wanted, for once, for one night, to be the thing that helped instead. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached forward and put her hand over his on the desk. His hand was cold, always, the cold of something that did not run warm, and hers was not, and she put her hand over his and felt him go very still beneath it. You were, she said, you were the thing that helped. Cale looked at their hands. It doesn't balance, he said. It doesn't have to balance, Mara said. It just has to be true. And it is. His hand turned under hers. Slowly, carefully, like someone handling something they were afraid of breaking. His fingers closed around hers. They stayed like that in the quiet study, while the night moved outside, and somewhere in the castle, a clock measured hours that neither of them was counting. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. His voice was quiet and direct, and she understood that this was not a small thing for him to say, that he had been carrying it for 300 years, and across 43 names, and the specific weight of them was in this sentence now, offered across the space of a desk to a woman who had stood at his gate without shaking. "I know," Mara said, and then, because it was true, and because she had decided some time ago that she was going to be the kind of person who said true things when they mattered, "I know, and it doesn't change what I think of you." Cale looked at her. "What do you think of me?" he said. "Someone who is trying," Mara said. "Very hard. For a very long time." His hand tightened slightly around hers. The lamp burned on the desk between the maps and the books and the accumulated evidence of 800 years of a mind that had never stopped working, and outside the castle windows the night was doing what nights did, moving through its hours regardless of what happened inside them. Mara did not go home until nearly dawn. She met Lady Sereth Vane on a night when the castle was not quiet. Mara had arrived to find the courtyard lit with torches and carriages lined up along the approach road, which had never happened before on any of her visits. The attendant who met her was moving faster than usual and wearing an expression of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. "A council gathering," the attendant said. "His Majesty's instruction was to bring you to the East Study, not the main reception." Mara followed him through a different route than usual. Narrower corridors, servant passages, emerging into a smaller room that had the same quality as the main study, but more compressed. Cale was already there when she arrived, still in formal clothing, the heavy coat, the signet, everything he wore when he was functioning as the king rather than the person she talked with about cartography. He looked at her when she came in, and some of the formality left his face. "I didn't know the gathering was tonight," she said. It was moved. He was already taking off the heavy coat and laying it across the chair, returning to the version of himself that didn't need armor. A council member died unexpectedly. Succession matters require immediate address. Mara sat down. "Is it complicated?" "Everything involving the council is complicated." He sat across from her. 3 of the houses are using the succession as leverage for positions they've wanted for 2 years. The deceased's family is in a state of genuine grief, and the council is conducting politics around them as if they were furniture. Mara looked at him. She could hear something in his voice, not anger, but the particular quality he had when something offended him on a level he didn't consider worth hiding from her. "What do you want to do about it?" she said. "What I want to do and what is politically advisable are different things." "Then what's politically advisable?" He told her. She listened. Then she asked several questions that she could tell, from his expression, recalibrated some of his assumptions, which was the part of these conversations she privately found most satisfying. Not because she was smarter than him, she wasn't and she knew it, but because she had a different angle of vision, and the angle mattered. They were 40 minutes into it when the door opened. Lady Sereth Vane was perhaps the most composed person Mara had ever encountered, and she had by this point encountered a significant number of composed people. Tall, older, or what passed for older in vampire terms, which was a relative concept, with silver hair and eyes the particular dark gray of serious weather. She wore her power the way certain people wore good clothing, completely without self-consciousness, as if it had never occurred to her that it could be absent. She looked at Cale. She looked at Mara. She came into the room without being invited and closed the door. "The council is asking questions," she said to Cale. "They always are," he said. "About her." Lady Sereth looked at Mara, not unkindly, but with an assessment that was thorough and made no attempt to conceal itself. "The human who survives the bite, the one you've been seeing for—" She glanced at Cale. "How long now?" 4 months, Mara said, because Cale seemed to be deciding whether to answer, and she saw no reason to wait. Lady Sereth looked at her with slightly increased attention. Mara held the look evenly. What are they asking specifically? Kale said. Whether your judgment is compromised, Lady Sereth said. Whether a human presence in the castle represents a security concern. Whether, she paused, and something in her expression became more careful. Whether you intend to formalize the arrangement. Kale was still. Mara looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked up, because looking at the floor was not something she did. And what do you think? Mara said to Lady Sereth. Not Kale, Lady Sereth. The older woman looked at her with something that might have been surprise. I think, Lady Sereth said slowly, that the council will raise objections regardless of what I think. I think Kale has been making decisions for 800 years and has not required the council's opinion to do so effectively. And I think, she looked between the two of them with the expression of someone reading a text and finding it more complex than the summary suggested, that whatever this is, it has changed him. She looked at Kale directly. You're less absent. You've always been present in the functional sense, but you've been absent in the other sense for long enough that most of us had stopped expecting anything different. Kale held her gaze, said nothing. The council will make noise, Lady Sereth continued. They will raise objections and invoke precedent, and be fundamentally unpleasant about species and status. She turned to Mara. You should know that. I've been told, Mara said. By him? Yes. She looked at Mara for a moment. What do you intend to do about it? Mara considered. Come to more council gatherings, she said. Lady Sereth's expression shifted, the controlled composure loosening slightly at the edges, into what might, in better light, have been amusement. She looked at Kale. I like her, she said, with a directness that matched Mara's own. That's my official position. Kale said, I know. Lady Sereth left as she had come, without ceremony, pulling the door closed behind her. Mara looked at Kale. He was looking at the door. She's been on the council for 400 years, he said. Her opinion carries weight. Is that your way of saying that mattered? Kale looked at her. Yes, he said. That's my way of saying that mattered. Mara looked at the door where Lady Sereth had been, and thought about the word formalize, and what it implied, and how it felt sitting in the room after being said, and then she looked at Kale, who was still looking at her. She went back to the political problem they'd been working on before the interruption, because it still needed solving, and because she was the kind of person who finished things. But the word stayed in the room with them, doing its own quiet work, for the rest of the evening. The first time he touched her face it was deliberate, and the second time it was not. The deliberate time, 3 months ago, the night she had challenged him about the crossed-out words. Cool fingertips against her jaw, clinical in its origin, positioning her throat, the night at the gate, but not clinical in what it had been since, in the way the memory of it had shifted in her mind from transaction to something else, something she filed alongside the 4 hours in the wooden chair and the coat around her shoulders. The not deliberate time was tonight. She had been arguing, genuinely, with some heat, which she had discovered he did not dislike, that he seemed to find it more engaging than agreement, about his interpretation of a historical conflict in the Eastern Territories, specifically his reading of the motivations of the human general involved, which she found condescending in a way she had told him so directly. He had responded with the precision of someone who had reviewed all available documentation on the matter. She had responded with the perspective of someone who understood human motivation from the inside. At some point in the argument she had leaned forward in her chair and made a point with more emphasis than she'd intended, gesturing, and a piece of her hair fell across her face, and Kale's hand came up without visible thought and moved it back. His fingers brushed her temple, her cheek, the edge of her jaw. He went very still. She went very still. The argument, which had been generating its own considerable energy, stopped existing entirely. Kale's hand was still near her face. He had not moved it back. He was looking at her with an expression that was entirely undefended. No layers at all, the thing underneath all the management fully visible. And it was, she had no better word for it, significant. In the way that things were significant when they had been a long time becoming themselves and had finally finished the process. Mara looked back at him. His thumb moved, very slightly, against her cheek. Not a gesture with a direction or a purpose, just present. She said his name, not as a question. He said nothing. His expression said everything the 8 months of their specific, complicated, unnamed thing had been building toward, said it all at once in a single undefended look that she would think about later, with the particular clarity that important things earned. Mara turned her face slightly toward his hand. The smallest movement, a direction. Cale closed the remaining distance between them with the care he applied to everything that mattered to him. Deliberate, precise, certain of what he was doing and choosing to do it, and he kissed her. Cold and careful, and absolutely certain, the way he was certain about the things he had decided to be certain about. His other hand came up to her jaw, and she felt the temperature of him as a specific thing, not unpleasant, the distinctive cold of something very old that ran on different mechanisms than warmth, and it was nothing like she had expected, and entirely consistent with every version of him she had encountered. She kissed him back with equivalent certainty, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing things by half measures. When they separated, he stayed close, his forehead against hers, his hands still at her jaw, and his breathing, she noted with the part of her brain that noticed things, was not as steady as usual. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. His voice was rough at the edges. Not the kiss. He paused. The part after. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His expression was still undefended, and she had the sense that putting the management back was going to take some time. "What does that mean for—" He stopped. "For this," she supplied. "Yes." Mara looked at him. 800 years old, she was 26. He remembered empires she had read about in books. She had opinions about cartographers and archive organization and political strategy, and she had walked through iron gates at midnight without shaking, and she had held her hand over his in the dark, and felt him stop being careful for just a moment. "It means," she said, "that we'll be bad at it together, and see what that produces." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "That seems inefficient," he said. "Most worthwhile things are," Mara said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, with the precision of someone filing something important, he said, "I have been alive for 800 years, and I have not wanted a thing the way I want this to continue." Mara felt that land in her chest with the full weight it carried. "Then it continues," she said. He pulled her close then, not the kiss, just closeness, her head against his shoulder and his arms around her with that same deliberate care, the cold of him and the oldness of him, and the specific, complicated reality of what this was going to mean in practical terms all present, and none of it resolved, and all of it, somehow, exactly what she would have chosen. Outside the castle windows, the night was deep and complete. Inside the study, everything was quiet. The council convened a formal session about her 6 weeks after that. Mara knew it was coming. Cale had told her, matter-of-factly, the way he told her things he thought she deserved to know regardless of whether the knowing was comfortable. Lady Sereth had warned her privately, a message sent to her room in the lower city in Lady Sereth's precise handwriting, 3 lines that said essentially, "Prepare yourself, dress well, and do not look at the floor." She wore the dark wool coat, her best boots. She put her hair up the way she had learned from watching the vampire court women do it over the months of her visits, severe at the base, precise at the temples. She looked in the mirror above the wash basin and thought about Elia telling her she had an expression she hadn't had before, and she thought the expression was still there, and it was made of something solid. The council chamber was everything Lady Sereth's note had implied, and nothing it could have fully prepared her for. 12 council members in formal robes, banners, the specific weight of accumulated centuries of political authority, pressing from every direction, and Cale on his throne, the full formal version, crown and signet, and the absolute stillness of someone who was doing something deliberately and had thought it through from every angle. He had not told her to stand anywhere in particular. She stood 3 steps behind his right shoulder, which felt correct, and Lady Sereth caught her eye from across the chamber and gave her a single nod. Lord Brennan Colt, who chaired the council and was 840 years old and had opinions that matched the vintage, opened the session by saying that the purpose was to formally address the ongoing presence of a human civilian in positions of proximity to the king. Mara listened. She listened through 40 minutes of procedural language that was its own sophisticated form of hostility, through references to precedent and bloodline politics, and the particular condescension of people who used the word human the way one might use the word temporary, which was fair in a narrow sense and irrelevant in every way that mattered. She listened and kept her face neutral, and thought about the eastern boundary problem and the cartography debate, and a man sitting in a wooden chair for 4 hours, and the specific quality of his voice when he said, "I have been alive for 800 years, and I have not wanted a thing the way I want this to continue." Lord Brennan concluded his opening with a direct question addressed to Cale. "What, exactly, is the nature of this arrangement?" Cale looked at him. Then, without looking at Mara, he signed something, one of the hand signals they had developed for the eastern boundary work, a private vocabulary, not sign language in the formal sense but something adjacent to it, their own shorthand. This one meant your choice, whether to speak. Mara stepped forward. The council shifted. Several members looked at her with the particular expression of people who had not expected the furniture to move. "My name is Mara Voss," she said. Her voice was even and carried clearly in the vaulted space. "I came to this castle 9 months ago to save my sister's life. I offered what I had for what I needed." She looked at Lord Brennan directly. "That is a transaction most of you understand." Several council members moved, slightly, acknowledging. "Since then I've been here frequently because Cale found my perspective useful." She paused. "And because I found his company worthwhile." She looked at the council as a whole. "I don't have a bloodline, or a house, or 800 years of political history. What I have is a different angle of vision and the willingness to use it honestly." She looked at Lord Brennan. "I understand if that's not sufficient for your purposes, but I'd ask you to consider that sufficient for his has been your bar, not his, and he's been meeting it for 8 centuries without your permission." The chamber was quiet. Lady Sereth made a small sound that in a less formal setting would have been a laugh. Lord Brennan looked at Mara with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then he looked at Cale. "She speaks for herself," Cale said. Quietly. Directly. "That," Lord Brennan said slowly, "is either deeply concerning or deeply impressive." "Yes," Cale said. Another silence. Then Lord Colt said, "She addressed the chamber rather than the throne." "That is what I said," Cale confirmed. Lord Brennan leaned back in his chair. He looked at Mara for a long moment with the eyes of someone who had been assessing people for nearly a millennium and knew what he was doing. Then he looked at the council. "The formal session will recess for deliberation," he said. It recessed for 3 hours. Mara sat in an anteroom with Lady Sereth, who brought her tea she didn't ask for, and told her about the last 3 humans who had been formally acknowledged by the castle. 1 100 years ago, 2 before that, with a specificity that was informative and a tone that was carefully neutral. When the session reconvened, Lord Brennan said, "On the matter of Miss Voss's ongoing presence, the council acknowledges the arrangement and will raise no formal objection, contingent on quarterly review." "Quarterly review," Mara said. "Of the arrangement's ongoing nature," Lord Brennan said, with the slight stiffness of someone who had agreed to something and was not entirely comfortable with having done so. Mara thought about what quarterly review meant in practical terms. She looked at Cale. He signed the private shorthand again. This one she had made up herself, borrowed from a habit she had of tapping her fingers on the desk when she'd reached a decision. It meant, "Good enough." "Agreed," she said. They walked out of the council chamber together. Not side by side in the formal sense. Cale was 3 steps ahead as protocol required. But when they turned the corner into the private corridor beyond the chamber doors, he slowed without comment and she walked beside him. Lady Sereth caught up to them at the end of the corridor. "Quarterly review," she said to Mara. Her voice was dry, effectively meaningless. "They've been threatening quarterly review of the Eastern Boundary Protocols for 40 years. Mara looked at her. "I know." Lady Sereth looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Cale. "She's going to be considerable trouble," she said, with what was unambiguously approval. Cale looked at Mara. "Yes," he said, with a flatness that meant something entirely different from flat. The night she told him she was staying was not a dramatic night. No council. No crisis. No eastern boundary problem or succession matter, or any of the apparatus of the life he had been living for 8 centuries. It was simply an evening in the study. Books, maps, the lamp on the desk, the specific quality of quiet that this room had when it was only the 2 of them in it, and neither of them needed to be anywhere else. Mara had been thinking about it for several weeks, not with the anxious circling of someone unsure of their own mind, but with the methodical thoroughness she applied to decisions that mattered. She had considered the practical elements, her room in the lower city, the archive work she did, Elia, who was healthy and self-sufficient, and had told her 3 weeks ago with characteristic directness, "Mara, I'm not 17 anymore. Stop organizing your life around the possibility that I'll need you in the next hour." She had considered the elements that were harder to name, the quality of the evenings here, the way the study had become, over 9 months, as familiar as anywhere she had been. The man across the table from her who was 800 years old and still learning things, and had spent 3 centuries counting a list he carried alone and was, she had concluded, in need of someone who understood that carrying it with him was not the same as being defined by it. She had considered what staying meant in the practical sense, which was a conversation they had not yet had, because having it required saying the thing that preceded it, and she had been deciding how to say it with the honesty it deserved. Tonight felt like the right night because it was ordinary, because she had learned over 9 months that the things most worth saying should be said in ordinary moments, not constructed ones. That significance landed better without ceremony. "Cale," she said. He looked up from the map he'd been annotating. "I want to stop going home," she said. He put the pen down. The movement was slow and deliberate. Mara looked at him, not as a short-term arrangement or a quarterly reviewed situation. "I want to stop going home because this is where I want to be, and I've thought about it long enough to be certain, and I think you know that I'm not someone who says things I'm not certain about." Cale was looking at her with the fully undefended expression, the one that appeared in moments that counted, and then was managed back the rest of the time. She had learned to read it as his version of saying everything at once. "There are practical things to work through," she continued. "The archive position, Elia, the council's quarterly review." She paused. "And there are the things that are harder to work through, the ones that don't have practical solutions." He said nothing, waiting, the way he waited, native territory. "You're 800 years old," Mara said. "I'm 26. She held his gaze. "At some point, that is going to mean something that neither of us wants it to mean. I'm not going to resolve that by pretending it isn't there." "No," Cale said, quietly. "I'm also not going to let it stop this," she said, "because the things that it stops are the cost of the things it doesn't stop, and I've done the accounting, and I know which side weighs more." Cale stood up. He came around the desk the way he had started coming around the desk months ago, no furniture between them, and stood in front of her and looked at her face with the full weight of his attention, which was a considerable thing to have on you. "You've done the accounting," he said. "I have. And the conclusion is that I'm staying." His hands came up to her face, both of them, the cool precision of someone who was careful with things that mattered, and had decided this was something that mattered, and was going to handle it accordingly. "Mara," he said, her name in his voice with that quality. Then, "I have been alive for 800 years and I have been alone for most of it, by circumstance and then by design, because design was more bearable than circumstance, and I have not," he stopped. "Started again. I have not known how to want something for a very long time without immediately accounting for how I would survive its loss." Mara looked at him. "You walked through my gates without shaking," he said. "You held your hand over mine in the dark. You sat in my study and argued about cartographers and told me true things about 43 names I have been carrying for 300 years, and you said they don't have to balance, they just have to be true." His thumbs moved against her cheeks, very slightly. "Stay," he said, simply, without ceremony. "Stay." Mara put her hands over his, cold hands beneath warm ones, 8 centuries and 26 years, the specific arithmetic of them. "That's what I said," she told him. He pulled her close. Not the kiss this time, closeness. The kind that was its own complete thing, her head against his chest, and his arms around her, and the particular temperature of him, the ancient specific cold of something that had been alive for a very long time, and was choosing, in this moment, to be here. They stayed like that for a long time. Outside the castle, the night did what nights did. Inside the study, the lamp burned on the desk, and the maps were still annotated halfway through, and the books were open at pages they'd returned to. And none of it went anywhere, because things that matter have a way of waiting. Aaliyah came to the castle 2 weeks later to have dinner, her idea, delivered in a message with characteristic directness, and she sat across the table from Cale and interrogated him about the eastern boundary problem with a thoroughness that made Cale look at Mara at one point with an expression that said, "Clearly, now I understand where you come from." Mara looked back at him and said nothing because some things didn't need saying. That night, after Elia had gone home in the carriage and the castle had settled into its late hours, Cale found her in the study at the shelves. The habit was permanent, helpless. She was incapable of being in a room full of books without reading spines. He came to stand behind her, not touching, close. "Your sister," he said. "Is a lot," Mara said. "Yes." A pause. "I like her." Mara turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, and he looked, she had no other word for it, fond. Not of Elia specifically, though perhaps that too. Of this. Of Elia being here and dinner, and the ordinary specific reality of a life that contained these things. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He went still beneath it, the way he always did, the complete attention of something that was very old and very careful. "You're going to be fine," she said. He looked at her. "At all of it," she said. "The practical things and the harder things, and the things we haven't named yet. You're going to be fine because you've been doing the difficult work for a very long time, and you know how." Cale's hand came up over hers against his jaw. "I know," he said, quietly, with conviction. "Good," Mara said. She left her hand where it was, and he left his hand over hers, and the lamp burned on in the study, and outside the window the night was doing what it always did, moving through its hours in the specific dark of the northern reaches, old and complete, and indifferent to the things that happened inside castle walls. The things that happened inside castle walls happened anyway. Spring came to the northern reaches the way spring came to cold places, reluctantly, incrementally, the ground releasing winter by degrees rather than all at once, the light changing its quality before the temperature changed, so that for several weeks the world looked warmer than it was. Mara noticed it first from the study window. The dead oak trees along the approach road were putting out the preliminary green of new growth, cautious and small, testing the air. She had been watching them since autumn, through the bare months, through the deep winter, and their returning was not surprising, but it felt significant in the way that returns always did. She had been at the castle for 4 months now. The practical arrangements had been made with the efficiency she brought to practical things. The archive position had been reconsidered. She now consulted 2 days each week rather than working full days, which suited her better, and the archivist better, and produced, she thought, better work than the daily attendance had. Aaliyah had come 3 times for dinner, and once had simply arrived on a Tuesday afternoon uninvited and spent 4 hours reorganizing the section of the library she found unsatisfactory, which Cale had watched with an expression Mara had needed to look away from because it was too much of something she didn't have a word for. The council's quarterly review had been perfunctory. Lord Brennan had asked 2 questions. Lady Sareth had answered one of them before Mara could, and the review had concluded in 14 minutes, which was, Lady Sareth told her afterward, a record. The harder things were harder, in the ways she had accounted for, and some ways she hadn't. The cold, not his temperature, which she had adjusted to, but the cold of 8 centuries, the specific weight of everything he remembered and carried, and had not yet found ways to put down. She had learned to sit with it, rather than try to address it. the way you sat with weather. Present, patient, not expecting to change it, but not leaving because of it either. There were nights when he was quiet in ways that were different from his ordinary quiet, when the counting was audible in him without being spoken, and on those nights she would bring 2 cups of tea she would drink, and he would not touch, and they would sit together in the study, and she would read, and he would be whatever he needed to be, and she would be present. He was learning, she thought, to let someone be present. She was learning too, things she hadn't expected to learn. The specific patience of a long view, when you were next to someone for whom decades were what years were to her. The urgent narrowed. The permanent things became more visible. She thought about things she had never thought about before, what she wanted to leave behind, what she was building, what outlasted the particular hours of a life. On a morning in early spring, she was at the window watching the oaks when Cale came into the study. He was not formally dressed. This was his morning self, which she had come to know over 4 months of mornings. Less managed, quieter. The version that existed before the day required things of him. He came to stand beside her at the window, looked at the oaks. "They're coming back," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "They do," he said. "Every year." There was something in how he said it, not sad, not dismissive, simply factual in the way that things were factual, when you had watched them enough times that the watching itself had become part of what they meant. "I want to ask you something," Mara said. He looked at her. "All the things you've watched come back," she said. "Spring after winter. Things returning. After everything you've carried, does it still matter to you? Each one?" Cale looked at the oaks. At the small, reluctant green of them. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet. "Perhaps more. Things are not more meaningful for being rare, but I have been alive long enough to know that the watching of things, small things, the kinds that don't announce themselves, is where most of the actual living happens." Mara thought about that. Then she said, "What's the smallest thing?" "That you watch. That matters the most." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her rather than the window. "Lately," he said, "the way you read spines. When you come into a room with books and you can't stop yourself reading the spines before you do anything else." He paused. "You don't know you're doing it." Mara looked at him. "That's very small." "Yes," he said. She turned back to the window. The oaks, the reluctant green. When she had come through the iron gates 9 months ago, she had been thinking about Elia's gray face and the 40-minute walk and the specific architecture of what it cost to offer the thing you had for the thing you needed. She had not been thinking about what came after, because there was no after in the plan. There was Elia, and there was the cost, and there was the transaction, and that was the whole of it. She thought now about the note on the inside cover of the book. I had not expected to find someone interesting. The crossed-out part beneath it, the thing that had taken weeks to say. She thought about 4 hours in a wooden chair, about a coat around her shoulders, about hands at her jaw, and the word stay, simply and without ceremony. She thought about 43 names and a man who had been counting for 300 years, and the specific thing it meant that he had started, carefully, to let someone count alongside him. She thought about spring, about reluctant green, about things returning because they had a nature that returned, regardless of the winters in between. "I'm glad I knocked," she said. Cale looked at her. 3 times, 3 times, she said, hard, because I had decided I was not going to leave without an answer. Something moved in his face. The thing she had come to know as the ancestor of a smile, or perhaps by now the smile itself, wearing a different face than what other people called smiling. "You were very loud," he said. "You should have answered faster," Mara said. His hand found hers at the window ledge. The specific cold of it, the weight of it, the centuries in it, and all that the centuries contained. She held it the way she had learned to hold it, present and certain and entirely without the intention of letting go. Outside the window, the oaks were putting out their small, reluctant green. Inside the study, the morning was doing what mornings did, light-changing quality, the day beginning to require things of people, the hours opening up one after another the way hours did, regardless of what had happened in all the hours before them. Mara held his hand and watched the trees and felt, in the particular way she had come to feel things that were true and settled and not going anywhere, exactly where she was, where she had chosen to be, where she intended to stay.